one of the things that you face with a cancer diagnosis is this incredible uncertainty of not knowing how things are going to be. And uncertainty, often that's a kind of disturbing word. Uncertainty, when there's an uncertain future, there's often worries linked to that. And resilience is really also what helps us deal with, recover from, make the best of difficult times. I think of it as a strength, a skill set, and a capacity. And resilience is sometimes talked about as bouncing back, but there are some things you don't easily bounce back from. You know, maybe that you recover with cancer. It may be that that's not an option that's available to you. And I think also this cork floating, sometimes just maintaining our buoyancy, looking at what keeps us afloat in a difficult situation, is another type of resilience. I think of that as bouncing with. And also something I've been inspired by, particularly when I've been at the Pennybron Centre conference last year, hearing talks of people who've been transformed through their experience of a cancer diagnosis, but also in sharing their experience. I love this image of ripples extending outwards, that we can all be involved in spreading resilience and sharing resilience. And so my hopes of this session now is that we have a conversation, and I also share some things that I found helpful in my work over the last 30 years or so, looking at what helps us build, nourish, and develop resilience. And do this. What I'd like to do is I'd like to share some of the tools that I find helpful in supporting resilience in other people, and also myself. And one of them, the most, is just this idea that there's a story of resilience. There's a story of resilience that we can get to know, and we can play our part in helping that happen. And you might think of examples either from your own life or from people you know, or maybe from films you've seen or documentaries or books you've read or articles you've read, where there's been a story that's had a difficult beginning, where there's been someone or a group of people maybe that they faced challenging situations where it didn't look at all promising to begin with, but the way they responded led to a better than expected outcome. And I'm just going to invite you to think of some examples of that storyline that you're familiar with and just write them in the chat window, thinking of, okay, stories of resilience I can think of, examples of resilience I can think of. Might be someone you know, might be a time you faced. There was a time when I went through this difficult time, but I got through that in a way where, looking back on it, it was I got through that better than I'd expected. And that's really a kind of a reference point. And whenever I do trainings in resilience, this is one of the places I start. I think of it as identifying inspiring examples. If we can have that as a reference point, saying, well, okay, I'm struggling with this now, but when I think of them there, and I've interviewed lots of people facing different kinds of challenges, including people facing cancer, and it's not always as simple as, oh, I did this and then everything was fine again. But it's more, I did this and that helped me develop a better version of this, or help steer it in a better way. So this is really the starting point. And what we're going to be following is really exploring, well, how do we make this more likely? And one of the ways we make it more likely is, whenever you're facing a difficult situation, ask yourself, what would a story of resilience look like here? Somebody who'd been on one of my courses had an emergency admission to hospital, very frightening for her. And she said that question, what would a story of resilience look like here, helped her face that experience in a way that it worked out much better than she thought it would. So she kept coming back to that question, okay, here's me facing this. What I'm finding frightening at the moment is, what I'm finding difficult at the moment is. But if this was a story of resilience, I think of stories of resilience as a bit like an adventure story. Adventure stories often have very difficult beginnings. They don't always have happy endings. But what they do is involve a journey of people facing the challenge, and kind of rising to the occasion, giving it their best shot in ways that lead to unexpected turnings sometimes along the way. So I'm seeing that Elizabeth, one of your favourite books, is Jane Eyre, and that you're also thinking of your own experiences of being diagnosed and going through treatments to where you are now as a bereavement supporter. And that so some of you are recognizing your own experience of resilient stories, or also resilient stories that you've been familiar with and you've come across. And I work a lot with the idea of storyboarding. Storyboarding is mapping out the story of resilience, and the simplest way is just to think of these two sides. The first side is, well, there's what happens, and then the second part is, well, what happens next? So what happens with resilience is often facing some kind of difficulty. I think of it as the downslope of difficulty. And a phrase I say to myself is, here's me facing this. Whatever's happened. I might be on a journey somewhere and my mode of transport grinds to a halt. That there's some problem with that. And I go, okay, here's me facing this. Might be I have a period of illness. Here's me facing this. It's something I say to myself in this current pandemic. Here's me facing this, the challenges that I have. And they'll be different for everyone, but I'm just inviting you to see yourself in this story right now. Here's you facing this, whatever it is that you're facing. There's a number of challenges, but really high on the list is here's you facing a diagnosis of cancer, or supporting someone else who's facing a diagnosis of cancer. And then there's what happens. But what happens next, that's still in front of you. What happens next is a story that involves your response as well. And our focus in this story is really looking at, well, here's me facing this, but what helps is. And that's really very much the work of Penny Braun Cancer Care. You work with people who've had very similar starting point, and you work together in groups, sharing stories about what helps is, sharing experience that's been built up over decades. I know, Catherine, you've been involved in this work for decades, really alongside people exploring this question of, here's you facing this, what helps is. And so what helps is, I think, at the beginning of the story, recognizing that not all challenges are the same. There are some challenges we face that we faced lots of times before, or we've kind of grown used to and we feel comfortable with. And I call that the green zone. The green zone is our comfort zone. The orange zone is where we're pushed outside what's comfortable or familiar, and we're you might think of it as the stretch zone. And it's also an important time for learning, where you might think, I'm outside my comfort zone, but it's a manageable stretch. That's the thing about the orange zone. It's, you kind of think, well, okay, I don't necessarily enjoy this or like this. I don't feel comfortable here, but I feel I'm managing okay. That's the orange zone. And then there are also times where we're pushed over an edge. We're pushed over an edge outside what we can manage or cope with, stretched into what I think of it as the red zone, maybe panic, maybe overwhelm. And in hearing about people's cancer journeys, there may be times where you had your moment of diagnosis that appeared as a real shock, where you were catapulted out of a comfort zone for you into a red zone. But what I've also heard is people, as they continue in their cancer journeys, there might be times where they, we'll come back to that, in their cancer journeys where they develop skills and resources and ways of coping that make that red zone more orange, or even at times green. And even when you're facing red zone times, you may still have what I think of them as like harbours of safety that you can retreat to. You might have your green zone moments. So I'm inviting you to just reflect on, how have you been just recently? Just say maybe over the last week. Would you say that you've been in a green zone of comfort? Comfort, or at least, this, I'm familiar with this, I'm coping, it's not too bad for me. Have you felt orange zone where you felt stretched? Or have you felt in the red zone where you've really been pushed outside your safety zones into a space where you feel more threatened, in danger, perhaps even panicky or overwhelmed? And in any week, we may have all three zones. But as a starting point for our story, I love that saying, in order to get to where you want to go to, you need to start from where you are. So where's your starting point right now? So I'm seeing, Julia, you're moving into the green zone with occasional lapses into orange and red. And I think of this as a check-in. I work a lot with self-talk. So self-talk is like, how do I speak to myself? And if I can find comforting and encouraging ways of supporting myself, this idea of positive self-talk, how do I speak to myself as if I'm an encouraging friend or encouraging coach? I think of someone like Catherine. If Catherine was alongside me now, what might she say? I might even remember the tone of voice of people you feel encouraged by, supported by, and thinking, what would they say now? How do you hear that voice? And one of the things I hear from that voice is, how am I doing? Okay, Chris, here's you facing this. How are you doing right now? What zone are you in? So I'm really hearing that you're in different zones, that some of you are in orange, some of you have green some days, some of you have scary things on the horizon waiting for an MRI scan, a fear of brain metastases. And that over the last 2 years, some of you also recognizing your journey. Your journey has been between different zones, but recently more green. So if we look at what does a story of resilience look like? A story of resilience involves facing what you face, whatever that is, but then also looking at what helps you deal with that in a ways where, if you're in the red zone, you might find, even if it's moments of green, that can replenish you, that can restore or regenerate. And I think of that, there's that lovely saying, ships are safe in harbours, but that's not what ships are for. And if you have a cancer diagnosis, sometimes it's about being pushed right outside your safe harbour into rough, scary seas. But also, are there times that you can have moments of safety, moments of restoring, refreshing, like find your safe harbour moment? So maybe that's one of the questions that we hold. So if we kind of go on with our journey, this is just a starting point of a storyboard of resilience, exploring the question, what would a story of resilience look like here? It involves starting from where you are. And resilience training, sometimes there are times where you can step back from the challenge. And I think of that as strategic retreat. Sometimes that's possible. But sometimes that's not an option that's available to you. And so it's looking at what helps you move upwards in terms of your coping capacity. And so here's this story, and I think of it almost like a comic strip, but you have blank. I use a lot these sentence starters. A sentence starter where you might say something like, here's me facing this ... and you fill in the gaps. And then what helps here is ... and you fill in the gaps. We're going to be filling in some of these gaps together. And when I say what helps is, one of the things I find most helpful, I work a lot with pictures. I call it the spider diagram. And I explain what I mean by this spider diagram. The spider diagram, if the present moment is, this kind of black spot, the body of the spider. And then each leg of the spider is a different way the future can go. And when we talk about things are uncertain, that's what the spider diagram is representing. It's just recognizing that whatever we face, we don't know for sure how things will go. And there are better ways it can go, and there are worse ways it can go. And just to say, one of the better ways it could go, Elizabeth is saying in this webinar, is if you could have a copy of the presentation. Very happy to pass slides on to Catherine. So just think of it, okay, wherever you are, whatever you face, this is the starting point of our story of resilience. We don't know how things will go. And on one side, we can say, oh, things are very uncertain. But the other side of uncertainty is that actually things might go better than we thought, as well as, it might go worse than we thought, they might go better than we thought, and we don't know. And so 3 useful questions are, whatever you face, you can say, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst that can happen here? and also what's most likely to happen here. And this is a perspective check developed by a team of psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania. They developed something called the Penn Resilience Program. And you can do it with your hand. You can say, okay, what's the best? And with that, you stick your thumb up. You know, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst that can happen here? That's this kind of pinky. What's the worst that can happen here? And when we're facing threatening situations, it's quite a natural thing to do to give a lot of attention to focusing on the worst. But also we can get stuck fixing on that. It's called awfulizing, where you focus on the more awful things that can happen. And I think what this spider diagram does is it just reminds us that we don't know. We don't know how things will go. That as well as the worst, there are also better ways it can go. And this thing about what's most likely, I love the phrase active hope. Active hope is where we start from where we are. We identify what we hope for, what are some of the better legs, better ways it can go, and then we're active in seeking to make that more likely. We're active in seeking to make that more likely. When you have a cancer diagnosis, you don't know what will happen. But what the role of Penny Brohn Cancer Care is to be alongside you in looking at how you can be active in making your hoped for versions of how it might develop more likely to happen. And it's here that I find very helpful what I call the double spider. So the double spider is about recognizing that sometimes, you were here and then you found yourself in a turning for the worse. And so that might be, okay, I had a diagnosis of cancer. It might also be in this time of pandemic that there are all kinds of challenges associated with that, not just the virus infection itself, but also the fear of infection, someone close to you getting ill, the loss of income. There's all kinds of uncertainties we face. So, and when you have these two big uncertainties together of a cancer diagnosis and the pandemic at the same time, may even be like a double down leg of the spider. But even here, from the bottom of a dip, there are still different ways it can go. And this is where I find the second spider, or this idea that any moment the spider diagram still holds. It's saying, well, what can you do from this point to make the better options more likely? Even if you have a terminal diagnosis, there are better versions of that and worse versions of that. I'm very inspired by a book called Stephen's Story, of a teenager with a diagnosis of cancer and then disappointing experience of metastases. And he wrote a book called Stephen's Story, which is really about how do I see this as a way of provoking me to make the best of the time that I've got. Sometimes you can add years to life, but sometimes you can add life to years, or life to months, or life to days. And it's saying, whatever I face, how do I find a better version of this? And this is really what a story of resilience is looking like. It's sometimes bouncing back to your old self. And sometimes that's not an option available to you. And it's saying, well, how do I maintain my buoyancy in this situation? How do I find a better version of this? How do I find a moment where, even though I feel I'm fully in the red zone, I have just half an hour where I'm feeling more green, where I'm doing something that I find comforting, nourishing, restoring. And we don't know what impact that has. I think this is a surprising thing, that when we give attention to moving in the direction of well-being from whatever starting point we have, that can also have an impact on our general well-being. So every now and again, I'm just going to stop and pause, and I'm going to say, how's this sounding to you? And that's, when I say, how's this sounding to you, that's really inviting any questions or comments. And I'm probably going to see you, Catherine, as kind of like the representative of everyone listening. And so there might be times where you ask a question that you imagine might be, others might be having anything to say or ask at this point.
There are a few questions you've probably, and comments about hope, and I think you speaking to this idea of active hope, and when is it false hope, and when is that helpful and unhelpful?
Thank you. And I find this double spider diagram here really helpful. So just for example, you know, just thinking about the virus, you know, back in February, I might have hoped for a summer holiday where I travel somewhere. And then as the year went on and I moved from February to March, and by the end of March, I'd really got some understanding about the virus where I found, you know, we're down here. We're in a new normal, a different situation. And the idea of me travelling down south, for example, I live in the north of Scotland, the idea of me travelling down south and seeing my mum, for example, who lives in Sussex, you know, that was an unrealistic hope. And if I was still hoping for that, but not taking in changed circumstances, that might be thought of as an unrealistic hope or a false hope. And so it's one of the things about active hope is you start from where you are, facing what you face, feeling what you feel, working with what you've got available to you. And then you say, from here, what do I hope for? Now, one of the things that's really difficult here is who's to say what's realistic and what isn't? Because sometimes we can have a restricted view of what's possible. And for example, I know that one of the pieces of work that you do at Penny Bron is you work with people who've been told by conventional doctors there's nothing you can do. And when there's nothing you can do, that feels like that's a limited view of hope. You know, I hope to be able to respond to this the best way I can. I hope to play an active role in responding to a cancer diagnosis. And if you've been told there's nothing you can do, that closes down the space. So one of the things we do is really look at, well, what choice points are available from where you are, from what you face? What's the best that you can hope for? And also, what are the choice points that are available? And how do you really map those out? And I think of this as realistic optimism. It's both exploring what's the best that can happen here, but having that what's the best that can happen here guided by available evidence. And I think it's good to stretch for the best opportunities, even if they give you a direction to move in. You might think, you know, there's a saying that if you aim for the moon, you might jump over the trees. Maybe it's not the right analogy, any metaphor. I think it's like choosing what works for you. But something I do sometimes is a process called scaling questions, where I say, well, what do you hope for? Let's call that 10 out of 10. And where are you on a scale of 0 to 10 right now? So if the 10 out of 10 is what I really hope for is, you know, it might be I hope for I'm completely well again. Maybe that's 10 out of 10. Well, where are you on the journey towards that now? Maybe I'm feeling so awful. I've got this, I've got that. I'm about 1 out of 10. Well, rather than focus on moving from 1 to 10, how would it be to focus from moving from 1 out of 10 to 2 out of 10? And when you get to 2 out of 10, how do you move from there to 3 out of 10? And I call this the journey approach to change. The journey approach to change is about starting where you are, identifying the direction that you want to move in, and then looking at steps that help you move that way. How's this sounding to you, Catherine? Are you muted?
I'm muted myself. Sorry. I think this echoes a lot of conversations that I do have with people individually. But if there are people who would like to ask Chris a question, do type your name into the chat, and we can maybe unmute you selectively, if you know, and make sure that there's time to say something at the end. But is this feeling relevant? It certainly feels like it's the things that we talk about, and it's very relevant to a whole suite of questions of how to broaden that spectrum of. I love your idea of if the horizons have been closed down to you by somebody, especially if it's somebody with quite a lot of authority and you feel quite a lot of expertise, then I think that's quite difficult to then reopen it up and feel that you're not sort of deluding yourself. And I think your idea of there's always a spectrum of things, and sometimes as doctors we are forced to go with the average, and that's the story we tell you. But we know that people aren't average, and that possibility and probability are really different. I think.
Yes, so here Jenny would like to chat, and also seeing there's a difference between probability and possibility. And I think there's also the word I'd like to put in here is desire. What do you desire? What do you deeply desire? And that's often about a direction. Okay, what I deeply desire, what's the direction I'd like to move in, but also what are choices available to me that help me move that way. And so when I talk about resilience, resilience is what helps me when I'm down in this pit, move in the direction of, I call it finding the upslope. And finding the upslope you can look at in different ways. You might say, well, okay, what I want right now is whether I get better and I'm cured, maybe that's beyond what I can even see in the horizon at the moment. Or when I work with people who are very depressed, the idea of being happy and well might seem out of reach. But I might say, well, what's a step in that direction? If you have better days and worse days, what makes better days more likely? And what is a better day? What does that look like? How do we move in the direction of better? And I'm aware sometimes there are difficult choices there, because you also look at timescales. With chemotherapy, for example, it might make you feel worse over weeks or months, but better over longer time frames, hopefully. And sometimes there's such uncertainty that you have no crystal ball, you don't know. And so it's looking at what combination of different choices and actions might be the best bet for moving you in a direction important. Catherine, I'm going to hand to you, because you have some choice points right now.
What do you mean?
Well, in terms of whether to bring somebody in or to pick up on some questions there, or I'll leave that in your hands.
Well, I just wonder whether it might be worth a 5-minute breakout where people can actually. You've given us such rich sort of things to think about and some really helpful metaphors. I just wonder whether that might be.
I'd like to go a bit further.
Yes, okay.
Because I think in terms of this, there's part one and part two. So part one is, here's me, here's what I'm facing. And what I'd really like to move on to is, okay, when I'm facing this, what do I find helpful? And look at what are some of the things that help us find our upward slope. So if we just continue this, and I know this idea of the boat and water level is one that you work with at Penny Brown. I just want to check if anyone hasn't seen this idea of a boat and water level, if that's unfamiliar. I'm just going to revisit it briefly anyway. I learned about this image when I was a medical student over 35 years ago. A very inspiring pioneer of the holistic approach, Patrick Pietroni, talked about well-being and health is a bit like rowing along in a boat. And sometimes we're rowing along merrily, and there are also times where our boat crashes into a rock. And we can think of a cancer diagnosis as an example of that. We crash into a rock. And a lot of healthcare focuses on rocks. Doctors and health specialists are a bit like geologists who know about the rocks that you might crash into. But also, the rock is only one part of the equation. What's also important is the water level. And the water level is like your background level of coping. So there might be times where there's a problem that you cope with well some days and you struggle with others. And so one of the things I explore with people in resilience training is, well, what are the times where you struggle? What are the times you cope less well? But also, what are the times you cope better? I tend to cope better when. And so this is a resilience practice, and this might also be an area of conversation. I tend to cope better when I'm struggling, when I'm facing this, I tend to cope better when. And what I do in resilience training is we focus on the upward arrow, because when you focus on the things that help you cope better, that has a buffering effect. And in terms of like dealing, for example, the threat of virus, for example, just recognizing that upward arrows can have an impact on your immune system, on your body's ability to deal with and recover from not just infection, but also cancer, any kind of illness. And so looking at, well, how do you build in upward arrows, and I get people to give attention to a toolkit of strategies, strengths, resources and insights. I call that the self-help SSRI. Those letters SSRI are often associated with antidepressants, and the work we do in resilience training is about helping people develop their resilience toolkit. Their resilience toolkit of strategies, strengths, resources and insights. And so strategies are practical things we do. Strengths are the kind of inner qualities we draw upon. Resources might be places, might be people, might be services, might be books. And insights are ideas. When I think this way, I find that an encouraging thought. And when I think this way, it makes me more likely to do this or do that. And if we think of these as resilience tools, and the work of resilience training is really reviewing what's in our resilience toolkit. When I'm facing a diagnosis of cancer, what are the things that help me? What are the things I turn to? And if you think of that resilience story of here's me facing, so that's where you name the dilemma and name the challenge. What helps me is. And these are the conversations I think it's really helpful to have together. And so what I was going to suggest, if we go into breakout rooms, have conversations, that we have this guided by some of my favourite resilience tools are. What I mean by that, if we have that two-part story, here's me facing, what I find helpful is. And if we're in small groups, it might also be that some of you are facing challenges where you're not sure what helps. And so you might ask others. You might say, well, here's me facing this. And at the moment, I don't know what helps. And I'd love to hear your hot tips so that we can have that discussion with each other. I don't know how this is sounding to you, Catherine, whether that might be a point to move into breakout rooms from.
I think that might be useful. I think one of the questions that struck me in the chat box is what to do when this all feels quite exhausting, when you're actually getting into active hope feels just a step too far or too much, because I think that people can be taken to quite a low place from where, like, that first step.
Yes, and so that's the storyboard. Here's me facing exhaustion. Here's me fed up with another person telling me what you should do is. Because every time I try one of these things, either it doesn't work for me or I'm actually so exhausted I can't see myself doing that right now. Here's me feeling exhausted, overwhelmed by lists of things to do and just fed up with the whole thing. So facing that, what helps is, actually one of the things that might help is giving ourselves permission not to do anything. Call it duvet time. Maybe strategic retreat is what I need just now. What I need is to maybe find a more, there's mindfulness, but there's a lovely term, kindfulness. Kindfulness is where I just focus on what's being kind to myself right now. Being kind to myself right now, maybe just accepting that this is where I am. And I find very helpful these words, acceptance and commitment. And acceptance and commitment are these two sides of the resilient story. Acceptance is here's me facing. So maybe it's just leaning into that. Here's me facing, feeling crap past my, pardon my language. Here's me just feeling so awful and wretched. I just haven't got the energy to do anything. Okay, well, what helps is maybe just accepting that I have some days where I call them, no good days, where I'm just no good for anything. And I'm just accepting that that's the reality of my story right now. I think there's one thing about facing difficulty, but there's another, which is feeling or hearing a critical voice that gives you a hard time for not doing more. And just to ease off that critical kind of undermining or overly forceful voice can be a helpful thing. And also there are some times where we do need to nudge ourselves a bit more to do something. It's like, here's me feeling this. Maybe if I just do the smallest thing that I can manage right now. The smallest thing I'm going to manage right now is there's a lovely phrase, resourcing. Resourcing is where, okay, I've got no energy, but I'm just going to focus my attention on something that nourishes me. It might be my favourite memories. Me here now, okay, I have no energy to get out of bed, but one thing I can do is I can, my attention is like a spotlight, and I can point it different ways. The spotlight of my attention, and I'm just going to give my attention to 5 favourite memories. It's kind of looking at what are the choice points available to you from where you are and what you face. I don't know how this is sounding in response to the question you raised, Catherine.
Yeah, no, I think your experience of having coached people in many, many different situations when really they felt they didn't have any choice points, but actually sometimes just swiveling your focus point, and realizing that there may be things that you hadn't considered, but they are within your control. Because it's a phrase that I often, and as you say, I have worked in this area in decades, and I really cannot think of a situation where there wasn't something we could do to make the best situation a little bit more likely. And I think that's something that is really, even if it doesn't seem like a very straight line towards that, just doing something that you can do, that is in your control, that feels like it brings a little bit more, as you say, pleasure, peace, rest, energy, whatever it is, comfort into your life, can feel like that can start the door move, that can start the process moving a little bit.
And just on research, they've done some research where looking at people's brain scans when they look at, for example, beautiful pictures. And beautiful pictures, you might think that's such a small thing, that's not going to cure me, that's not going to help very much. And this is something here about the power of small things. It's not going to help very much, but even if it helps by just 0.1%, that might be just enough just to tip you just a little, and then you think, okay, well, I moved that tiny step, and then if I was to take another step from there. But what the research showed as well is that when people gave their attention to pictures that they found beautiful, people in chronic pain felt less pain. And one of my, I think of, that idea of inspiring examples of resilience. There's a book called, or a film called, I think it's The Butterfly and the Diving Bell. And it's about a man in his 40s who has a stroke that leaves him paralyzed in bed, unable to move his limbs. I think the only thing he can do is blink. And what he said was, because he developed a way of communicating through the kind of blinking and ended up writing a book about his experiences, just from this incredible form of communication developed with a language therapist. And he said that what was available to him was his memories and his imagination. Everything else had been taken away. But what he had left was his memories and his imagination. And from that, he was able to draw on memories and his imagination to take his mind and attention places that were better. I interviewed somebody who was kidnapped and held in an underground cell for months at a time in complete darkness, social and sensory isolation. And one of the things he did that helped him find a better version of that time was that he'd remember people who'd been important to him, and he'd actually compose a speech and give them a speech, in this kind of underground cell. And the most awful situation, but I think of that spider diagram. Here was him facing this, such a desperate situation. But one of the ways of making a slightly better version was to remember important people in his life. And he kind of, through his imagination and memory, he was able to access a support group through his memories and imagination. And I suppose what I'm interested in, this is a really big piece of work really, are from where we are and what we face, what are some of the things that act as upward arrows that just nourish us a bit, that restore us a bit. It's not the whole journey, it's not the whole answer, but these are the choice points available to us in a day that help us make a slightly better version rather than a slightly worse version of how that day works out. And it's through building up a toolkit of these that we can live into the story. What would a story of resilience look like here?
And I love your double spider as well, because I think sometimes we make a decision, but it does turn out to not be such a good decision. But there's always learning from that and the next choice point, and they come quite quickly. So I think it's often easy to think, oh well, last time it turned out bad, that means it's going to just go from bad to worse now. But actually sometimes people have learned extraordinary things from things that have not been so good or haven't turned out well, that actually looking back have really helped them get back on that upslope that you talk about.
And thank you. It's very helpful, because of course it's not just one thing and another thing. It's life is a constant repeating of this process. It's more like a roller coaster than just a part one and part two. But in any moment, we can think of that story of there's what's happened and then there's what happens next. And so it's just thinking, okay, me here facing this, that's what happened. That's part one. What might help here right now? And I'll try something, and it may work, or it may work a little, or it may work for a while, or it may not work. And then that brings you to another starting point. Every moment is a starting point. And then it's saying, okay, from here, facing what I face, what might be a better way this can go? Catherine.
Yeah. One of the questions that's come up in the chat is around, why is it so difficult for sort of conventional doctors, oncologists, to kind of engage with this sort of thinking? And I think it's a really good question. And I'm wondering whether next Monday, we've got Professor Rob Thomas, who is an oncologist, who I think we could actually ask that question to. And, I've had various conversations with people, and I think that it's a really interesting conversation around what they feel their role is, and trying to get into their mindset and where they're coming from, and realizing that they have one part of the story to tell, that they feel, that partly their professional guidelines are telling them that's the story, partly time restrictions mean that that's the important bit that they can tell you that nobody else can tell you. But I think I'd really, if anybody is interested in that and how we can better engage with the conversation about getting this sense of moving forward with your healthcare professionals as part of the team, but in a spirit of active hope. And why does that feel such a difficult thing to do within the conventional system? Then I think next week it would be lovely to, if people want to join in and ask Rob some of these questions too. I'm sure he'd be very happy to answer that too. And we can bring this back up again, but maybe it's something to talk about in the groups.
And just to say that oncologists vary, and some are just really shining examples who really, and I think of it that there are some doctors who focus more on the rocks, and there's some who've really got an understanding of water level. And that in terms of roles, I'd say let the doctors be geologists, let them help us with the rocks. It's so helpful. If you've got a particular kind of problem, it's so helpful to see someone who knows about the problem. But see the doctor as part of a team rather than the storyteller of the whole story. That you've got a role too. So the doctor's department is the rocks and dealing with them. Your department is dealing with the water level. What are the things that push it down? What are the things that push it up? And that's also a big part of Penny Blonde Cancer Care, is that you are water level specialists. You help people look at what happens when they get depleted, but also what they can do to help build and nourish. And you talk about there are drainers and there are nourishers, and what can we do to build in more nourishers? And I think this is a both and approach. Sometimes I know, having worked as a doctor in hospitals and in general practice too, they're incredibly squeezed for what the time they've got and the pressures they're under. And maybe it's also about our expectations. We don't expect them to sort of have the whole truth. And so we say, okay, well, they're part of the thing, but we play our role in terms of self-care networks. By the way, thank you, Sally, for saying, reminding the book. The book is called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bourby, as a resilient story. Did you want to break into small groups, or were there other questions?
It's a very good question. I think there's always a tension between, but why don't we just go into breakout rooms for 5 minutes, literally, until, do you have more that you want to tell us, Chris?
Well, I've got, I suppose if we're looking at this question, some of my favourite resilience tools it's a conversation I love. I love to hear from other people, and I've also got another favourite tool I could share if there's time. But also, I think that as well as learning new tools, it's so important to recognize, what am I already doing that's helpful? And particularly, what are some of the discoveries I've made in my cancer journey? Because if we have, as groups, times where we can share some of the things that we found helpful. I remember a time where I was facing, the MRI scan, or I was going through this treatment, and what I was facing was, but what really helped me was this, this, and this. And then I found doing this, or, if we can share our stories, and just because something's worked well for one person doesn't mean it will for another, but at least we're expanding our range of options. And sometimes there's a discovery process where, as humans, we learn by copying other people, by modeling, by hearing stories of what's worked for someone else and then trying that ourselves. How long did you want to break into small groups for, and what size did you want them to be? I'll leave that
Well,
in your hands.
I think 4 or 5 is quite a good number for small groups, because then everybody does get a chance to talk. So I think that might be good. I think some of the questions coming back from the group. So what it might be good is to, as a group, decide if there are some questions that you want to ask, answering Chris's questions about what's in your toolkit that you might want to share into the picture as well. But if you've got any questions, because I think it would be lovely. A lot of people are saying it's quite nice to hear your answers to things in the big group, and I think they want to.
Well, maybe I can pick up one. Just Barbara's asked. I'd like to ask about dealing with nighttime. You can be okay and focus on the positive and choices during the day, but it can be a different experience at night, where anxieties and fears can take over. And I suppose in response to this is an example of saying, well, okay, how do you apply a storyboard approach here? And if we just, let me just see, if we just do the storyboard thing where we just say, here's me facing this, this is my challenge. Here's me facing this, the challenge of nighttime. And what I find difficult about that is, and then you take this on as a project. And what I mean, take it on as a project, you might not necessarily expect to find an instant solution just straight away, but this is your current growth edge. My growth edge is, I'm okay, I'm not so bad in the day, but it's at night time I'm most likely to be in the red zone. You might think of that as high risk times. A high risk time for me is at night time, where this kind of problem is most likely to come up. So I'm going to start having conversations with people. If we go into a small group, I might ask around, what do you do at night time? One of the things that I have found very helpful at night time is I've got relaxation recordings on my mobile phone. And when I wake in the night and I'm struggling to get back to sleep, I use these recordings, and they take me somewhere. I have one that was on an old cassette tape that I had 20 or 30 years ago, and I converted it into a digital recording, and I've got it on my mobile phone, and it's a half-hour stroll into a forest, and I meet a wise person who gives me a present, and have a kind of healing waterfall. It's these kinds of relaxation strategies really help me. But also, you can try 10 different recordings and love one or two and hate the rest. And so, in terms of the journey, what does a story of resilience look like here? It involves a quest where you know what you're looking for, and then you try different things, and there's a kind of trial and error process. I don't know, Barbara, what's going to specifically help you with anxieties and fears. But what I hear is, what I can see you're writing in the chat, is that you're on the case. You're on the case in that you're holding the question, and a question can become like an inquiry. You can ask the same question every day, and every day explore different answers to that. And through that process, in your roller coaster, some days, some nights you'll find something more helpful. Sometimes there'll be things that work less helpful, that you might move from feeling that I'm 1 out of 10 in terms of my progress here, to actually I'm about 4 or 5 out of 10. I found some things that help a bit. I'm still not really got it. I still have nights where I really struggle, but actually, the number of nights where I struggle as badly as I used to, it's improved a bit. And that's often this is what I think of as the journey approach to change. What's the direction I want to move in? What's the steps that help me move that way? And it's a project we take on, and we get some discoveries along the way. You're smiling, Catherine.
I'm loving this idea of, I think one of the things that we really try and remind people about is it's so easy when you wake up in the night to think, oh, here we go again, this is always what happens, but not do that, not realize that actually it's happening less frequently than it did maybe, or it's lasting less long than it used to. And so I think what Chris is, I love his scaling. How bad is it now? Because sometimes even if it moves from a 1 out of 10 to a 1.5 out of 10, you're onto something useful, and that is progress. And I think being able to celebrate some of that progress. So we often get people to fill in that health and well-being wheel. And if people want me to circulate that, I can with the recording as well. It's like a spider diagram, not Chris's spider, but it's a round diagram where people can rate their personal resilience in a number of different areas. And even if something small just shifts a tiny bit on that, and it shrinks and expands over time, and different areas become stronger and different areas become more challenged. But over time, just small notches up actually start to add up. And I think this point of like little small differences, when they start adding up or start being recurrent over time, can really shift our biology and really start to make big differences when they're all added together. So I think that idea of being able to somehow take a note of where you are now, so that when you look back, it's easier to start to see some of that progress, which becomes encouraging in itself.